Hello and welcome to the Anyone Can Play Guitar podcast,
which gives you, the listener, a series of hints and pointers on your journey as a musical artist.
providing you with interviews from those in the music industry, along with our own experiences.
Ben and James shine some light on the many pitfalls and opportunities that being a musician has to offer.
Last week we had the first part of our double header with Mark Duffett of Chester University, where we discussed tradition, consistent image, being memorable, playing your audience as an instrument, and using your music. In part 2 this week, we talked to Mark about being a star, being a fan, entertaining people, ideas and values, as well as collaboration. Welcome to episode 8 with me, James, and him,
The golden one, Ben.
Ooh, yeah. Mixed it up a bit there.
Yeah, I'm owning it.
Right. Okay. You threw me a bit there.
Yes, I always like to do that. Keep you on your toes.
Yeah. I actually am on my toes at the moment. I don't know why I'm sitting like this.
There's a Pavlovian response for me doing...
I think it was. I don't know, but is that my go-to position when you throw me a
The thing is, you
curveball?
don't know if they were like that before, though.
I don't. I'll never know that.
Neither will I. What I'll do is I'll throw you another curveball at some point, but check your feet out first.
Right.
And see if it works.
Damn.
So look out for that.
Yeah. Well, I will. Well, I probably won't.
Exactly. Otherwise, what's the point?
Oh, God, I'm on edge now.
You should be. Right, James. Part 2. Mark Duffett.
What did part 2 follow, Ben?
Part 1.
Excellent.
Thank you. Thanks for bringing that back up. I'm sure our listeners were looking for you to do that this week.
Well, I hope so. And then they'll have it.
Yeah, it's part of our story.
Oh, another part.
Yeah. Pick a part. Oh, I'll stop there.
Good. So we continue on the points that we were going through with Mark. I guess if listeners have listened to part 1, they'll have a gist of what it is we're going about. So I feel like this episode probably doesn't need too much in the way of introduction.
No, the actual points though are seem very person specific. Whereas last time we're looking at the fans as an audience and as an instrument. This time we're getting to the person themselves as the fan and the artist.
Okay. Yeah, but again, some good stuff, some reasonably obvious things that it's good to get into a bit more of the detail on, and there's some other things which certainly there's at least one of them that I just hadn't really thought about, which as soon as Mark talked about it, I was like, well, yeah, obviously that will be a thing. Which and this is again part of why we were keen to do the podcast.
Exactly.
Because what's obvious to someone is not going to be obvious to someone else. And whilst I'm looking at one of those points that I hadn't thought about, I'd like to think other people would be maybe looking at one of the other ones and go, oh, well, no, that's the one that I hadn't really given much thought to.
Yeah, and that could get you 10 extra fans, 20 extra fans.
Hey, if it gets people, an extra one fan, then no bad thing.
No, not at all. Excellent. So
here we'll go for part 2 with Mark Duffett.
Brilliant.
Okay, so moving on at number 6, we've got Be a Star. Now, I know for a lot of bands starting out, or a lot of artists, one of your main thoughts are, right, how the hell am I going to play this instrument? Or how do I write some words? Or how do I make a song? Now, some people may well approach it from I'm going to be famous, I'm going to be this amazing, interesting star from day one. But I suspect a lot of people, this wouldn't even be on their radar, even if you've been in making music for some period of time. So I'm interested in your thoughts, Mark, on what being a star is and what that means to fans.
Yeah, well, I think you're right that a lot of people spend a lot of time concentrating very hard on music, but making music, the ABCs of making music and songwriting and all these things, which is useful to know. But at the same time, what they then forget is they want to make a living as a professional musician doing something interesting or in front of a live audience, then actually having an interaction with that audience and carrying that interaction inside themselves, which I think is what stardom is. So really, I was talking about charisma there, and that charisma, I think Marshall McLuhan, the media scholar, once said it was being worth or being a large number of people. In other words, carrying yourself in a certain way that implied that a lot of people were interested in what you were doing. But I also think, like going back to the previous one, like using your music as a vehicle for intimacy, so not an end in itself, but a means to an end, is what I would sort of associate with stardom. And also kind of stardom in some ways, even though it seems a bit shallow, is about kind of being loved, right? Mm. And so having an attitude is important in relation to that question of, am I happy with being loved, or you know, that there's all sorts of different spectrum of different behaviours, if you like, in relation to that. But I think that's what I mean by being a star. I mean being somebody that people can relate to, but at the same time that in that process of relationship you become kind of worth something. You carry the audience with you, but not necessarily in a narcissistic way.
So it's that totem pole thing you mentioned before.
I think a lot of people will have different levels of comfort with that concept as well, of wanting to be loved and being comfortable letting people be aware of that. You know, you look at first song on the first Stone Roses album, Ian Brown was quite happy to sing that I want to be adored.
Yeah.
You know, whereas for other people that might be a really uncomfortable sort of concept depending on their personality. You know, so I think it's an interesting point.
It is,
and I think different people will have very different levels of comfort with that.
Yeah, and I think it's. I mean, you were the frontman in our band. I'm quite glad I wasn't sometimes, because you are the focal point, and we have played with some people. I can't remember the lad's name, but he wanted to be a star, and you could see it, and it's quite a strange one. I don't know whether it was our competitive nature, as in, well, why does he want to be a star? Like, just get on with the music. So I think it's a very brave thing, actually, if you're going to stand up in a bar to 10 people and still perform like you're performing to 100,000 people. It's very brave, actually. So
I'm thinking back. I'm not sure if I necessarily wanted to be a star. Now, whether that was a help or a hindrance, you know, it
depends on the ethos of the band, I guess, as well, which I think we get on to later.
I think it's a great point, though. You know, it's part of that becoming a really popular artist, that there is an element of star, and if you're not that interesting, charismatic sort of person, then there's a challenge there, I guess.
Yeah, I saw a band last year at a festival, and the lead singer, you couldn't take your eyes off him. He was a star, but he was only essentially playing to 25 people, but didn't matter to him, and it made us follow that band a little bit longer. They haven't done much since, unfortunately, but I still looked them up, and after the festival, even though they were like on a unsigned stage, I still looked at them more than I looked at the new album by the headliner, for example.
Yeah. So as Mark, I'm interested in, you know, you've studied Elvis a lot, who's obviously one of the biggest stars of all time. What do the likes of an Elvis or some of the other really big stars do that other people who never perhaps quite make it to that level of stardom, what sort of traits do they display that they really nail and other people perhaps don't?
Well, I think with the whole kind of totemism thing, I think George Michael actually said this once, that to be a star, it's not that you have something extra, it's that you have something missing. In other words, once you start becoming popular, it's actually the things that are vulnerabilities or kind of limitations that allow the audience a way in to relate to you. Because otherwise they just see you as some big narcissistic ego, which is okay if you've got amazing music to match, like maybe like Queen did or somebody, and it's almost like a genre expectation, right, in certain forms of music. But I think I think, you know, you look at Elvis, he just, there's everything is right in the package, right? The guy looks amazing, he's got an amazing voice, he moves on stage in an amazing way which kind of interacts with the audience. He kind of brands himself across a whole range of genres of music eventually, and he's also got an amazing story about kind of coming from a poverty-stricken background, which actually allows the audience to get into following him. I mean, it's like, I don't know. Did you watch the BBC4 documentary last Friday on Mark Bolan? Because on that, the first thing that they showed you is the headlines when Mark Bolan died. Well, we're all more fortunate than somebody who's died. And it's kind of a weird thing to say, but I know some cynics kind of say, oh, well, dying is your best career move. I wouldn't particularly endorse that, but, it's interesting that it's those moments where, like, the audience can feel, wow, you're amazing in some way, but also, my goodness, you're actually also, in your appeal and your story, you're actually worse off than me in some way. And it's that sort of weird contradiction that I think allows somebody like Elvis to be that big. And what you were saying earlier, that in a sense, he is okay with that going for it. Whereas some other people might be like, oh, I don't know if I want to be that big and not have much privacy. And, I think there's a famous story where when Carl Perkins kind of realised how big he was getting and he kind of stepped back from it. But Elvis never stepped back from it. He just kind of went for broke.
Yeah, true.
No, I like that. I think the whole point about maybe not being perfect, and if you strive to have that beautiful, perfect, polished brand, perhaps, then you're not given a bit of that weakness, the cracks, the vulnerabilities for people to relate to. So no, I think that's a good point.
That's a good point, yeah.
What does celebrity journalists do all day? They look for those weaknesses, they look for those cracks, and actually, in the way that they do it, they invite audiences in who maybe don't like the person as well. What you're trying to do is kind of invite people in who maybe would like you, so finding kind of slightly more positive reasons to be vulnerable, if you like.
So, leading on to the next point 7, we've got be a fan.
Yeah, well, I think being a fan is one of those sort of common touch type things that puts you in connection with the audience and kind of suggests a certain beguiling amateurism. It doesn't mean that what you're doing is totally rubbish. It just means that you there's an edge that is on it or knocked off of it, if you like, to make it a bit more interesting. And it also shows that you're kind of following in a musical tradition, which I think for some people is quite useful. So, yeah, just there's nothing wrong with saying, I like a particular artist. As long as people can see if you say I'm fascinated by Van Morrison, then as long as the music that you're making is not exactly a clone of Van Morrison, then brilliant.
Yeah, it's actually a good story Noel Gallagher said when I think they were around about, what's the story, Morning Glory time, Paul Weller gave him one of his Rickenbackers, and he said that he was awestruck that Paul Weller was around his house, never mind giving him a Rickenbacker, but all he wanted to do was kick him out the house so he could go and play a Town Called Malice on it, because it was just like that whole tangible thing, and that made you think of, he's a fan of the Jam as well, or whatever. It's there's a really interesting point. It's that because I'm a star or an artist or Noel Gallagher or whoever, I can't like stuff. I have to only I can only like weird and wonderful stuff. No, like, you're allowed to listen to the Beatles and the Jam or whoever, who are obviously massively popular throughout the history of the band.
Yeah, and the Beatles were fans of Elvis and went to see him, and loads of people were fans of Bowie, right? And like it's a very common narrative. And if you think about it, it's a bit like that when you see those things like X Factor or whatever. That moment where you see somebody, in going back to their hometown. It's kind of like going back to your hometown a little bit. It kind of puts you at the level of the normal people again to realise, that person is and was a fan of somebody else.
Yeah, it shows a genuine passion for music as well, I think.
Yeah.
Remember an example of, it was maybe the day after Sgt. Pepper's had released and Jimi Hendrix played it live on stage.
Yeah.
And like that would have been, the previous day would have possibly been the first time he'd heard it, and it initially made you think that he's obviously spent all night learning this. But that's often what a lot of people do, isn't it? Like when you first hear a song, you try and learn it on the guitar. You try, and it's like, oh wow,
that's the same way.
He's a fan of music.
I mean, I know this is a football example, but when Cruyff did that turn, every kid on the park the next day tried to learn the Cruyff turn.
Yeah.
Or when, I don't know, someone came out with like Smells Like Teen Spirit. Like, that's a riff you want to learn straight away.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, there was plenty of those kind of moments in popular music history and in other forms when all of a sudden, we're living in a different world because somebody's come out with something really interesting, and it sort of sparks a whole trend in different ways.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Next on the list, number 8, perhaps an obvious one, but something that would be good to talk about, is entertain people.
Yeah, because I think entertainment is maybe different to making music, insofar that making music is part of entertainment, but entertainment to me seems to be a more kind of all-round thing, in which if you look at some of those more interesting people in music history, that there's elements of comedy in what they do. Even when they're off stage, they have interesting comments, and maybe that's partly a process of us looking for that. But I also think that it's almost like they're a walking talent show in themselves, right? That they've got all these different aspects to what they do, and each of those aspects works in connection with the others to kind of draw people in. So entertainment for me isn't just making music and kind of going home afterwards. It's kind of almost like being always on and being a sort of a beguiling or an interesting character and sort of expressing that in these different ways and formats.
Yeah, that reminds me as well, actually, of when Oasis hit big. I know I mentioned them already. Bobby Gillespie from Primal Scream on the same label, and one day he walked in the office and there was like 40 times the amount of people that worked there, obviously. And this lady said, I just market Liam Gallagher. And he said, just give him a microphone, he'll do it himself. And that is that whole entertaining. Like, there's loads of examples of people who do that. I mean, Robbie Williams is another good example. Look, like them or loathe them, he entertains people in everything he does. Even when he's on Ant and Deck on a Saturday Takeaway programme, he's still entertaining people just by being himself.
Yeah, he's a character. And you think back to the 60s and people like The Doors. I mean, The Doors have got a bit of a problem because they're not easily marketable in kind of genre terms. But what does Jim Morrison does? When he talks to the newspapers, he says things like, we're erotic politicians. Well, at that particular time in society, that was a bit shocking and interesting and kind of generated discussion. And so sort of speaking good copy, I think, is part of this process, or can be part of this process of entertainment. Another example is the Bill Grundy show when the Pistols were on.
Yeah.
There's nothing much to do with their music in a way, but because it kind of drew lines and sort of created this kind of version of juvenile delinquency that was kind of interesting and kind of explored the generation gap a bit, people kind of was drawn in there. So there's like endless examples of this kind of entertaining kind of characteristic. But I think the opposite way around is, what about the people who don't do that? How do we see them, or do we see them as much?
Yeah, I would say, well, we don't. I guess if you're only entertaining engagements, or the point of time where someone might see you live, which might be once a year, once every couple of years, depending on who you are, or when they happen to play your music, then that might be quite a lot. That might be not so much. If that's your only point in time where you can entertain, then you're missing out a whole load of other things. Whether it's other like social media or other things. There's so many different mediums to do it. But yeah, I guess if you're only entertaining, on the song itself or during the live performance, I would feel like you're limiting yourself.
Yeah, I would agree, but I also think sometimes you're creating that mystique. I mean, this kind of goes into the next bit about embodying ideas and values. You think about someone like Kate Bush, who essentially disappeared for years and then came back and did a residency in London. That kind of added to her fandom, the fandom of when she's going to do something else. That whole need for it, for the product. I hate to call Kate Bush product, but
no, I take your point though.
But that's rare. That is completely rare.
But like Elvis hasn't been around in person for some time, but he's still been entertaining people year on year.
Very true.
So I guess there's something in that.
Yeah.
Well, what they did with Elvis was they released an entire album of him just talking on stage at one point, because he had got to that level of fame where they knew that would sell, right? But,
wow.
Yeah, I mean, Kate Bush, she had such great material and she kind of packaged it in ways that suggested kind of creativity and fantasy, and so people were kind of hanging on it. And what happens in those circumstances is that, in a sense, other people in the media industries will work to do that entertaining for you. I think will try and make you into a more entertaining character than perhaps you are worried about being. But that whole thing of creating mystique, yeah. I mean, that certain versions of classic stardom were associated with that in the kind of Hollywood, like classic Hollywood days of the 40s and 50s, when people were kind of styled in certain ways, but also the public didn't know much about them. But I'm not sure if we don't really live in that world anymore. It's quite hard to disappear now, I think. And so perhaps if you are going to be around, then perhaps being around in a way that I don't necessarily mean like that's the only option. I think that idea of it's maximising your opportunities is probably the best way to put it. But there also might be ways in which you can focus people on particular aspects of what you do. Like by how you dress, by what you say about yourself, that might, if you think, oh well, I'm not that entertaining a person, it's really the music that I want to push forward. Well, then there are ways to do that without necessarily having to be the all-rounder. But I actually think the all-rounders are quite interesting.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and equally, not thinking about it too much, because if you try and pre-plan or force, or stage all of your entertaining content or messages or whatever it might be, then it can potentially come across as fake. But if you don't give it any thought, you could end up putting out a load of drivel that has the opposite effect.
Saying things you regret, or I mean, if you're sort of raising the issue of consistency with yourself, if you like, then you're back to number 2, aren't you? That having a consistent image.
Oh, definitely. So, in terms of embodying ideas and values, what does that mean from your perspective, from a fan looking at their stars?
One of the things that I kind of realised by looking at fan cultures was that obviously culture has a content, and when you think about the reason that people become fans, often they say it in very personal terms, like I really felt a connection with such a person. But then the interesting thing is when they stop becoming fans, often that's for more kind of social reasons, like, oh, I didn't like the fact that they were in a scandal, or I didn't like that they dodged their tax, or whatever the thing was. And so you kind of realise that actually these fan bases often do to some extent share certain values, and that then if you kind of get into it a bit more, those values are often embodied in the stars that they are fans of. So they might like Dylan for his kind of like rebellious creativity, or whatever. They might like punk for its mischief, or Elvis because he seems to kind of constantly embody the rest of American culture or popular culture. He seems kind of like the democratic sponge that just kind of sort of eventually everything's nobody's outside of the fan base almost, or at least that was he was perhaps his aim. I'm not sure there's always going to be people who elitists or whatever that kind of dismiss that, but I think that was his aim. So that's what I mean by embodying ideas and values, just having something to say. I mean, something interesting, being interesting in some way. And I suppose older people or people who are interested in the past, sometimes find it a bit depressing that, there's not so many people around that are like that anymore, or maybe we're not looking closely enough. I don't know.
Yeah, instantly when you were talking about this, I mean, someone like Billy Bragg, for example, always had something to say. There was generally always a social point of some kind behind all the songs, and I know it's a fair question in terms of whether that there's still that body of content or people writing songs where they really do have a clear point to say, and maybe they do, maybe like you said, Mark, maybe people aren't looking close enough. When again going back to the Maximo Park album, their latest offering, they've gone far more political and in terms of social commentary than they ever have before, and so I don't know, that there'll be other examples where I think it is out there, but how much it's in like the mainstream of millions of records selling that have sort of social commentary, I don't know.
Go on. I mean, it feels to me a little bit like we've kind of got into quite a narcissistic time, right, with celebrity. That it's almost like the system's kind of folded in on itself, so it's harder to kind of speak outside of it, perhaps. I don't know. Maybe that's a... But something like Billy Bragg always does, right? He always did. But then, you know, he's like... I mean, in a sense, that's his genre.
Yeah, good point. Looking at that last point here now, we're going to point 10. I'm really interested in this one because I didn't know how to take it, actually. Know when to collaborate.
That could be a few interpretations.
Yeah, a few interpretations. Yeah, I'm ququite interested to get your take on this one.
I suppose I got to this point and I thought, what else have I got to say? I wasn't quite sure, and I thought, well, actually, yeah, you know, if you look at somebody like Elvis, he was always kind of kept out of collaboration with his manager, whereas some other groups have sort of strategically played that process of collaboration, whether it's Ed Sheeran with Stormzy or whoever. You know,
right.
There's that sort of duets and different kind of meeting points between different artists, and I think what's going on there is also there's a meeting point between different audiences. That when you were talking about Coldplay earlier, getting more kind of poppy at certain points or whatever, that, you know, this is that when you see these larger artists, there's often a process of negotiating which sort of block of audience they want to kind of tap into at particular points. And collaboration is part of that. And I think maybe, I guess when you do cover versions, perhaps that can be seen as a form of collaboration, that you're putting yourself in connection with a different kind of music or kind of tradition.
That's something I'd not considered, to be honest. That, you know, there's obviously when you know, artists get to a point where they have a larger fan base, that there'll be very different demographics within that fan base, and they're targeting, you know, specific parts of that fan base with certain songs, types of songs, and people they'll collaborate to do that. I can totally see that being a thing.
Yeah, and I think actually, if you think about the bands who are unsigned or just starting out, maybe looking at that next section is... next section sounds harsh, but not your mates. So they're all going to come. You don't want to neglect them or take them for granted, but it's the kind of, how do I look at the other bands that are coming to gigs with us, and how do we tap into their fans as well?
Exactly. And, you know, when you think about stuff like music festivals, you know, part of what a music festival is kind of compounding the audiences for all these different acts. Or it might be, like, the example I always think of is rock and roll. You know, rock and roll did so well because all of the individual markets that it kind of took from, like R&B or gospel or country music, records were selling much smaller amounts. So when artists started combining all of that, they got into much bigger sales, and then they had much more prominence, and they kind of, the stardom kind of developed from there. So yeah, that process of collaboration is, sometimes you have to think of it in commercial terms, that it's about kind of manoeuvring these audience blocks, and that can come through in the music as well.
Yeah.
And people don't think of that because they think of music as their ego property. That, you know, this is my thing that I'm doing. And when you look at it, actually, you know, it's also part of a process of negotiating with an audience and a wider culture, isn't it?
Yeah,
definitely.
I think there's definitely, you know, points 9 and 10 can definitely be strongly related. You know, if you're going to collaborate, you know, make sure that that collaboration still ties with the ideas and values, and potentially back to the image and brand that you have. You might want to be going into a new sort of genre, or tap into a different type of fan base with a particular song or whatever, but if that completely conflicts with the values that you stand for as an artist, then, you know, that there's probably a lot of margin for error.
Yeah, and I think you're going to maybe disrespect or try and alienate your hardcore fan base that are always going to be there.
Yeah.
And like, there's some albums, like some bands I've followed for years, and I still buy their albums now, even though some of them have been a bit not to my taste. You always think they're going to come back, and that's but you could easily lose a chunk of your hardcore fans.
You gain an extra one fan, but lose two.
Yeah, who have been there since the start and will buy a T-shirt.
Yeah, there can be a trade-off process involved, or it can be a process of sort of stepping out in faith to find whether the new audience is there for people. But yeah, absolutely. If think twice before you collaborate with people with very different values from you. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, brilliant.
Excellent.
Okay, well, that's covered the 10 points there, Mark, and I think there's some great content and a lot of things for people to think about. To be
some things I've got to think about.
Perfectly honest, definitely. So before we wrap up, one of the things that we have been touching on in all of the episodes that we've had on the podcast is for any of our guests, any charities or good causes that they have close to their heart, which doesn't need to be related to music, just to get the message out and just a quick bit for our audience potentially to get involved or to support. And we know that you sent through a link for the Penny Brohn charity. So if you want to give a quick little description about who they are, what they do, and why you're a supporter of them.
Yeah, Penny Brohn was diagnosed with cancer in 1979. She had breast cancer, and in 1983 she opened a centre for people, treating people in a more holistic way. And she died herself in 1999, but the centre's still going. One of my family went to it recently. And they do wonderful things in terms of educating people and getting people to connect through the illness and kind of helping people. And, as far as I know, I think the rate of cancer diagnosis in the UK is something amazing. Like, is it 1 in 3 people at some point in their lives could get cancer now?
Something scary like that, yeah.
It is high.
It's certainly, I know for breast cancer, it's 1 in 8 women. So it's a pretty high, common thing, and I think anything we can do to help people in that situation is important. So yeah, absolutely, I would advocate the Penny Brohn Centre, which is down near to Bristol. I think they've got their building.
That's right, yeah.
Oh, brilliant. Well, we'll put a link in the show notes to that. And again, speaking of show notes, we'll also mention your book, Understanding Fandom, that you mentioned. Is there any other things that you're working on at the moment?
Yeah, I have a couple of Elvis books in the pipeline. One's more kind of introducing debates on Elvis to students. I can send you a link for that. And the other one's a kind of review of Elvis's 100 best songs. So that was a lot of fun to do.
Yeah. Can I just ask, actually, I noted down earlier, why Elvis?
Well, my academic career was a bit odd because my first degree was at Oxford University doing geography, so it was a sort of a long stretch between that and Elvis. And I then went to Canada and I wanted to study popular music, so then they said, study, if you're going to come here and do that, look at the music industry. So I did a MA looking at the Canadian music industry. And then I kind of realised, and then I briefly worked for Sony Music, and I realised I knew a bit about how music was produced and how it was marketed, but I didn't really know anything at all about, why people were fans, what drove their passion, and I've been a fan of a few things, so I started studying that, and I thought, well, who can I choose who's got loyal and prominent fans? And it seemed that Elvis was the obvious answer, but the amount of cultural baggage that went with that at that time, I was a bit naive and I didn't really think about. But I think now we're at a point where Elvis has he goes through kind of phases of uncool and cool, and he's coming back into a cool phase now, I think, with the orchestral albums and things.
They were different, yeah, because my aunties are, I'm not going to say the biggest Elvis fan, because that's never going to be true, but she adores Elvis, and that was the first time I went, you know what, that's really interesting. It was something I thought was different, and it kind of got me a little bit listening to it. Still, I'm not a massive Elvis fan personally. I like a lot of his tunes, but that was the first time I went, oh, that is different and good and modern.
That's a fair enough comment, but my challenge to you would be, go back and watch Elvis's comeback special.
Right.
And have that list in front of you of all the things we talked about today, and see, what you can learn from it.
That's a good
Because I
point.
think, you'll find that's quite an amazing performance, and actually it does tick a lot of those boxes we've been talking about.
Oh, there's some homework for
Yeah,
everyone.
definitely.
Yeah. There you go.
Well, look, Mark, thank you very much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, been great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, and I hope it goes well with the podcast.
Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, there's a lot of points in there. A lot of points.
There was a lot of points. And Ben, I like a point.
You do like a point. Yeah, you do.
First thing for me that I was thinking about when I was listening back to this is, I said it in the interview that I think different people would be comfortable with different levels of the whole being a star thing. And maybe that's just because of me, and
possibly.
And maybe the vast majority of people would absolutely love to be a star, and it's just my sort of way of thinking. On reflection, I did think...
I think it's the word star, though.
Well, maybe. But you know what? I felt more comfortable being a star, or at least a front man, when there was bigger crowds. If we were playing to 100, 200 people, then I was far more comfortable being up there and sort of doing my thing, as opposed to when we were starting out, or the odd time where we hadn't put the effort in terms of promoting or whatever, and there might be sort of 20 people there.
Mm-hmm.
I felt uncomfortable being front man in those scenarios, and
it's very
maybe that's
intimate at that point.
Maybe it's a failing on my part, in that you should be up for it and giving it your all, irrespective, because those people have still come to see you, and at no point should they get a worse performance. And like I say, that was definitely a failing of mine. But it's certainly from a level of comfort. I felt far more comfortable with the whole wanting to be a star and front man in certain scenarios, I guess.
Yeah, what I was meaning about the word star, because the word itself, the connotations of that word is like stars, like stars in your eyes, or pop stars, or like, it's a big word. It's a big concept of being a star. But he's completely right, and you're right what you're saying there. You should be a star to 5 people if you're busking, or 50,000 people if you're Chris Martin, or whatever. So I think the star is something to think, actually, that's what other people do. Or I'm not quite a star yet. I'm just someone who plays in a pub, in a band. But it's a mindset to be in. I think we come across a couple of them, and there's a couple I've seen recently. I think I mentioned it in the interview as well. Like the front man looked like a star. He was playing a dozen people in a little tent in a festival. But it was like, they might as well have been packed. He was the star, and you were watching him. And I think it's easier for like the likes of me, Simon, and Rob, who could hide behind our instruments a little bit, let them do the talking. If we're happy, we're like,
potentially again, like I was a front man who, although we messed around with a little bit in the early days, I didn't play an instrument. I was just a singer, and there's just me and a mic stand between everyone. And
the thing I've got makes a loud noise.
There's something in that.
Yeah, I think when you throw words out like charisma and star and how you carry yourself,
I was doomed for failure before it started.
Well, I don't know. It might be a different type of charisma, but like you think of people like Robbie Williams, who we spoke about. If you like him or loathe him, he is what you could say as he has that stardom, that star quality, that X factor, if you want to say that phrase or whatever. And you have to think about where he's on stage at Nebworth when he did all those massive gigs about 10 years ago or so, or where he started, and think you go all the way back to those TV performances and take that where you think he's just a bloke dancing around. It takes a long way to get there, and if you're in a band and you're playing to 10 people, 20 people, 50 people, 100 people, getting your crowds bigger, it shouldn't matter how many there is, but it is a mindset and a minefield to get yourself through it.
Yeah, I think that's maybe why I gravitated towards like the Ian Curtis's of front men. Like, he wasn't someone who was going to sit and tell jokes or stories in between songs or sets, but he still pulled off being a front man very well. And I think that's sort of where, because as much as I love Bowie and others, like I knew that wasn't me. There was no point in me trying to.
I would like to see the day you came in with face makeup on and like a star on your face or something. That would have been brilliant.
Well, yeah. God.
I was expecting more of an Ian Curtis look, to be honest.
It just, well, it wouldn't have worked. But
it would have worked for that night. It would have been brilliant.
Maybe. But yeah, looking back on it, I can sort of see why I would have logically gravitated towards people that I perhaps viewed as a star, who went about doing it in a way that I felt comfortable doing. We mentioned Jim Morrison at some point in the interview.
Yeah, he popped up.
In the early, I've got nothing to back this up other than I read it in one of the books on the Doors that I've read years and years ago. In the early days, he did a lot of their gigs, if not all of them, with his back to the crowd. It took quite a lot of convincing him to actually face the audience. He's had a particular personality.
Yeah.
And he was, I would probably say, undoubtedly a star.
Oh yeah, without a doubt.
But as Mark alluded to, in his own sort of way.
Well, I think people like, from our generation especially, people like Liam Gallagher have got a lot to answer for, because they are just naturally charismatic, naturally. Like, if you watch any video of Liam Gallagher from Supersonic, way back when, just oozes star quality, just naturally got that thing, and it's kind of think, well, just do that, just do that. He's not a star, he's a lad from Burnage, but he is a star. He's just Liam Gallagher, isn't he? So,
but I think that's part of the thing. You know, every artist is a lad or a lass from somewhere.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
They've all, you know, everyone who makes music's come from somewhere. That, you know, the whole argument of, well, was someone born a star, or, you know, nature, or all the rest of it.
Stuff, yeah.
But yeah, it's, you know, there's obviously different ways of being a star, and I don't think there's necessarily, you have to be that outlandish, outspoken, loud, you know, sort of personality type to be a star. There's just very different ways of going about it. So some might capture the attention or the imagination, you know, quickly or more obviously than others. But there's certainly a whole range of
Well, like, that actually is a good point, because we spoke about this briefly in the first part of this episode about the drawn on tradition, but being a fan, it has that whole Mark mentioned, like, a common touch. Now, I think that's a really good term to use, because it's kind of like, I'm a fan just like you, and that's the connection that we have. Yes, I get up and sing songs and perform in front of 50,000 people, but we are still the same, and that's what you're just saying there about this person started out somewhere as a fan.
I mean, that person, the bit that I liked on that point in terms of that connection was the bit about having a vulnerability or a weakness of some kind, something that helps people, a fan, relate. Whether you're a massive artist playing to, you know, tens of thousands, or whether you're, you know, just someone starting out, if you're building up this sort of image or brand or whatever it might be, if you try and craft that brand image as being sort of a perfect, you know, I don't know, person, entity, character, whatever it is that you're creating, if you don't have that weakness, that vulnerability, that common touch, that's something that the cracks that someone could relate to say, oh well, that's a bit like me, you know.
Yeah, definitely, because the likes of your pop stars, your major pop stars, they're marketed so heavy you can't see the cracks because they're polished over so much until a few years down the line on the second, third album, and that starts to come out because they've got so much money. They realise they've had 5 years of just disappeared, and they're so protected. They
disappear very quickly once one crack's been revealed. Yeah. And so Mark was talking about, you know, whether a bit of comedy's added in, and that whole being always on or a walking talent show.
A walking talent show, that's quite a good comment.
Yeah, I don't know, I'd have found that pretty tiring, I guess, but I mean, because on the one hand, you know, part of what I love doing is entertaining people, whether it was in the band, whether it's doing this podcast, whatever it's doing. But constantly always being on and at it. I don't know.
I think that's where you get the fine balance of being yourself. If you've got that stage persona, having that elements of it, but certain people we've spoken to just kind of embrace that way of life, as long as it's not like too much and it's just completely blurring the lines of reality. Then it's.
But ultimately, if you're an artist, you are there to provide people with a form of entertainment, and ultimately, there's 1,000,001 other things that a fan could be doing with their time. So why are they going to listen to you, watch you, whatever?
We've also got collaborating, using the other fans, and so
Well, I found that interesting. That's the one thing that I hadn't really just thought about being a thing, but it's completely obvious once Mark spelt it out that if someone's trying to grow their audience, they'll collaborate with someone from a different genre, not because, well, that type of music might go with the musical direction that we're necessarily heading in or whatever. It just might introduce a whole big chunk of extra fans into the equation, which is extremely obvious. I guess I'd initially thought of most collaborations just as an offshoot to do, I don't know, something interesting musically or whatever it might be. But there is obviously a fan element to it and bringing new people into the fold.
Totally, and one of the examples he used was music festivals. And we mentioned that on the previous episode about how you've gone into Hot Chip, for example. But I listened to an interview, or read an interview with Faithless, and they did say that they always find that as an opportunity, if a music festival, to win over the crowd. We're not here to see, well, some people will be there to see them specifically, but if you're not, we're going to prove that we're the best band on this bill, even if you don't think we are. By the end of it, you'll think that we're going to win you over.
Well, one of the other things that Mark mentioned that I found quite interesting, a bit in terms of if someone's got to the point where they're big fans of you, they'll wear the t-shirt, they're bought into your ideals, your values, whatever you're conveying, then he said that a lot of people fall out of being a fan due to sort of social type reasons.
Yeah.
So, whether that's from big artists, not paying their taxes, or whether they've done something in their personal life, so something that can be potentially completely aside from the music side of things, but the artist has done something that is at odds with their fans' values. That's one of the biggest reasons why people will jump ship and say, all right, I'm not a fan of them anymore. That just shows the importance of living and breathing your values, particularly in this day and age where it's quite easy for people to find out a lot, particularly when part of what we've been talking about in other episodes is about sharing your story, about yourself, your values, bits about yourself. If you do something that's at odds with all of that, then
that's a really good point. There's multiple examples of where people have done things which are not nice things, completely lose an audience, completely lose a career.
One of the final things that I had was
you had homework.
Well, yes. Well, Mark is all good lecturers,
yes.
All good people who work in the educational world set some homework, which I think is absolutely fair. So we'll put some links into the show notes for the Elvis comeback special, and he said that watch in relation to the 10 points that we've gone through, and I find that a lot of them are covered off.
Elvis is a great example of fandom. Those TV specials are something else. How to control an audience and how to work them even when he mentioned about the gold disc, as in we've got nothing to say, so let's present a gold disc, and people went crazy for it.
Yeah. So well, if ever there's been a star with fans, he's the man. So definitely one to watch and take stuff from.
Yep.
So the final thing for this episode is the charity that's close to Mark, which is Penny Brohn, cancer charity. Again, very good cause, very worthwhile. Website is pennybrohn.org.uk. We'll put links in the show notes to that. So again, as per previous episodes, whether you want to just donate or whether perhaps you live in the Bristol area where the charity's based and you want to actually, get involved, or whether it's just you want to donate a couple of quid or whatever you can do it. It's about getting the message out about yet another great charity.
Yeah, I think it's even by just visiting the site and seeing what they're up to, that can help as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the amount of people cancer is just
and it seems like a local charity to help
crazy,
people at certain points. Yeah,
it touches so many people. So great thing to support.
Yeah, definitely.
So coming up next week, an episode I could have certainly done with back in the day, where we talk to vocal coach Nicola Milan. With our first Aussie on the show, we cover breathing, placing your muscles, vocal tone, and conveying emotion.
We've reached the end of this week's episode of Anyone Can Play Guitar podcast.
Big thank you for tuning in, and remember to stop by iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts from and subscribe so that you never miss an episode.
While you're there, it would be amazing if you could leave a rating and a review.
All the show notes can be found at www.acpgmusic.com, and if you want to get in touch,
email us your questions, any feedback and any suggestions to info@acpgmusic.com.
That's it for now. Keep supporting upcoming artists,
and we'll catch you next time.